In the summer of 1983, the world came within inches of nuclear annihilation because a Soviet early warning system mistook sunlight reflecting off clouds for an incoming US missile strike. Let that sink in. Civilization almost ended because the weather had attitude. Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast where hypothetical nightmares are explored so vividly, you'll forget which ones haven't happened yet. Today's question: what if the Cold War didn't stay cold? What if it went thermonuclear? The Cold War, despite the threatening name, was essentially an arms race fueled by paranoia, chest-thumping, and really impressive espionage mustaches. It lasted over 4 decades, cost trillions of dollars, and climaxed in some truly iconic propaganda posters. But through it all, nobody actually pushed the big red button. The button remained pristine, unpressed, trembling quietly in silos and briefcases across the globe. But what if someone had? Let's set the stage. It's 1962. Kennedy and Khrushchev are playing nuclear chicken over Cuba. Missiles are in place. Diplomats are chain-smoking through their soul. And somewhere in a Soviet bunker, a nervous technician sneezes near a launch console. And unlike in real history, this time, the sneeze counts. The first exchange isn't dramatic, it's horrific. Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles. Gone in minutes. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev. Vaporized. The missiles are not precise. They don't need to be. Megatons don't care about accuracy. Within the first hour, 100 million people die. That's not a projection. That's not an exaggeration. That's just math. NATO forces scramble, not to counterattack. Most leadership has ceased to exist, but to survive. In bunkers across Europe, generals read outdated nuclear playbooks while wondering whether they're supposed to retaliate or just start praying. Meanwhile, civilians do what humans always do in apocalypse scenarios: loot supermarkets, blame the government, and fight each other for cans of beans with suspicious expiration dates. The nuclear winter begins before the last mushroom clouds finish rising. Ash blocks out sunlight. Temperatures plummet. Crops fail. Global commerce ends. The concept of currency is replaced by how many potatoes do you have and are your organs still functioning. But it's not just the bombs. It's the collapse of systems. Electricity grids go dark. Satellites are fried by EMPs. Communication reverts to radios and shouting. Think Fallout, but with less irony and more dysentery. Of course, some leaders survive. In bunkers buried so deep they double as geological time capsules, generals and politicians huddle with their maps and regrets. The U.S. continuity of government program kicks in. Nuclear submarines with surviving command structures begin transmitting emergency protocols. Soviet submarines, doing the same, pick up distorted American signals and assume an invasion is coming. More warheads launch. It's like watching 2 blindfolded jugglers toss live grenades in opposite directions, then high-five for teamwork. Meanwhile, nations not involved directly, India, Brazil, Indonesia, look around and realize they've inherited a dying planet. With atmospheric particles blocking the sun and average global temperatures dropping 10 degrees, agriculture collapses. Famine spreads faster than ideology ever did. In Africa and Southeast Asia, entire nations dissolve into migration zones, pushing borders into chaos. And then, the mutations begin. No, this isn't a superhero origin story. Radiation doesn't gift people laser eyes, it gifts them tumors. Babies are born with missing limbs or extra ones. Cancer becomes a routine diagnosis, like seasonal allergies, except with fewer tissues and more funerals. Governments fragment. Military units become city-states. In North America, surviving forces of the U.S. fracture into coalitions, some loyal to what's left of the Constitution, others ruled by former governors turned warlords. Canada absorbs refugees until its infrastructure breaks, then shuts its borders with a politeness only Canadians can manage. Sorry, but no? And the Soviets? Their regime collapses within a year. The KGB splinters. Former republics declare independence, not because they crave freedom, but because Moscow is now a radioactive lake. The Iron Curtain didn't fall, it evaporated. Religion makes a comeback. Not the peaceful kind. The end times are here, better stockpile ammo kind. Cults flourish. Prophets with Geiger counters lead survivors to clean zones. which are often just less terrible disaster areas with potable water. Some preach that the war was divine punishment for global decadence. Others claim aliens will come clean up the mess. Neither are entirely wrong. Neither help. In China, the Politburo survives by sealing itself underground and issuing decrees via radio. But with the US and USSR gone, China becomes the sole industrial power, at least temporarily. It tries to rebuild trade with fractured states, but radioactive fallout and global famine make diplomacy awkward. "We'll trade you rice for iodine tablets" becomes a common offer. It rarely ends well. And yet, amid the ash and chaos, something even stranger happens. Humanity doesn't go extinct. We adapt. We always do. Villages rise from ruin. People find old knowledge, agriculture, solar tech, chemistry textbooks. Books become precious again. Libraries guarded like temples. Bartering returns. So do storytelling, oral tradition, myths about the time of fire, the black sky, the great detonation. Children are taught that once, the world was lit by cities and powered by wires. That people flew in metal birds and spoke across oceans. That gods lived in screens. Some believe it. Others laugh. But no one denies the sky once roared. And so we end part one in a world remade by heat, soot, and stubborn survival. Not better, not wiser, just alive. Which, considering the circumstances, is a minor miracle. In the ash-stained remains of civilization, survivors quickly learned that nukes may have destroyed cities, but it was the collapse of routine that truly broke humanity. No one remembered how to live without Wi-Fi, but suddenly everyone needed to know how to grow carrots and not die of radiation burns. Food became sacred, not gourmet, not even edible in the traditional sense, just not glowing. Anything that didn't hiss when poked was considered dinner. Supermarkets were stripped in hours, and then came the real treasure hunts, raiding vending machines, looting old grain silos, and, if desperate, eating canned goods so old they predated disco. Governments, or what remained of them, struggled to project authority. In the US, remnants of the federal structure began operating from bunkers deep in the Rockies. They called themselves the Provisional Union. Their messages, relayed through sputtering radio channels, insisted that democracy would return soon. Most people outside the bunkers interpreted this as a joke and went back to fishing mutant catfish in radioactive rivers. In Europe, NATO had become a whisper. France, spared from the initial blasts, tried to reassert itself as a beacon of civilization. It didn't go well. Germany was reduced to a smoldering lattice of cratered autobahns. The UK, with its leadership reduced to static on the BBC, reverted to monarchy, albeit with a twist. The new king ruled from the Scottish Highlands, wore camouflage, and crowned himself using a broken satellite dish. His royal decree: survive, but make it British. But perhaps no region saw a stranger transformation than Scandinavia. With low population density and relatively minimal strikes, Norway, Sweden, and Finland became some of the few functional zones left. Their strategy? Hide in the fjords, eat fish, and pretend none of it was happening. It worked. To this day, some say Norway didn't survive the war, it simply outweighed it. Meanwhile, humanity's greatest minds, at least the ones not vaporized or mutated, turned their attention to the new global dilemma. How do you rebuild when the blueprint is radioactive and half your neighbors think you're a post-apocalyptic hallucination? Enter the rise of tech monasteries. These were not actual monasteries in the traditional sense, though some had stained glass made from melted smartphones. Instead, they were isolated communities built around preserving knowledge. Think Silicon Valley meets medieval scriptorium. Engineers with Geiger counters transcribed code onto parchment. Chemists brewed medicine in beer vats. Philosophers argued about whether artificial intelligence should be resurrected or left buried with the rest of humanity's poor choices. One such monastery, nestled in the ruins of MIT, called itself the Archive. They ran a wind-powered mainframe named Gideon that held the last known backup of Wikipedia. Access was granted only after passing a series of tests, including a written essay, a literacy exam, and a blood test to ensure you weren't too irradiated to handle a keyboard. Religion, too, adapted. Some churches rebranded entirely. Catholicism gained a radiation saint. Evangelicals started holding services underground, literally. One sect even declared that Jesus had returned as a dosimeter and could beep out moral guidance. It beeped a lot in Nevada. Then came the new currencies. Gold, worthless. Bitcoin, gone with the data centers. Now it was all about water, seeds, antibiotics, and intact books. Knowledge became the new capital. A functional generator could buy you a village. A working Geiger counter? You could trade that for a house, a spouse, and maybe even indoor plumbing. But beneath the scavenging, the hoarding, and the bartering, there was a growing realization. The Cold War had not been won or lost. It had simply melted everything down to a single truth. Mutually assured destruction had worked, until it didn't. In the Soviet sphere, chaos reigned supreme. With Moscow a memory and the KGB fragmented, former republics either dissolved into feudal microstates or fell under the sway of local warlords with more bullets than brains. One such warlord, a former chess grandmaster turned people's commander, ruled a chunk of what used to be Belarus. His motto, no checkmate without survival. His flag featured a knight's helmet superimposed over a fallout symbol. China, once poised to become a superpower in our timeline, found itself both blessed and cursed. While many of its coastal cities were hit, the sheer size of its inland population meant that a significant portion survived. The government, now operating from a secure zone deep in Sichuan, issued a global radio broadcast declaring the formation of the new Middle Kingdom. The message was met with static, laughter, and in some cases, gunfire. India, ravaged by climate disruptions and fallout drifting across borders, became the center of a migration storm. Millions fled the irradiated north for the south. The Himalayas, once majestic, now formed an impassable radioactive wall. Those who stayed behind called it the glow. And Africa, long ignored in Cold War politics, suddenly became humanity's last hope. Large portions of the continent had avoided direct strikes. Local governments adapted quickly, deploying solar power, traditional agriculture, and community-based resilience strategies. In Kenya, a group of tech-savvy survivors set up a Pan-African network called PhoenixNet. Its mission, reconnect the world, one solar repeater at a time. Back in the Americas, South America emerged as a complex patchwork of survivalist republics. Argentina declared itself the guardian of Earth's memory and began collecting artifacts from the old world: music, books, even Coca-Cola cans. Brazil split into ecozones, some verdant sanctuaries, others lawless wastelands. The Amazon, now glowing faintly in the dark, was rumored to host a secret society of scientists trying to reboot the biosphere. Or maybe it was just an irradiated sloth cult. Accounts vary. And so, with the old world gone, the new world began, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a stubborn cough, a bite of canned beans, and the whisper of wind through skeleton cities. In the end, the Cold War did not freeze history. It incinerated it. And from the ashes, humanity crawled, not forward, not backward, but sideways into a new, grimly hilarious version of itself. One where the question wasn't who won, but who's left. The funny thing about nuclear war, if funny is even the right word, is that it doesn't end when the bombs stop falling. In fact, that's when things get truly surreal. When the mushroom clouds have faded and the world stops glowing like a discount rave, people still have to wake up, scrape the ash off their breakfast, and ask themselves what comes next. Spoiler, it's not brunch. In the ruins of post-World War III Earth, history became something passed around by word of mouth, like gossip in a burned-down village. Children whispered legends of glowing cities in the sky. Teenagers spray-painted murals of fallen metropolises with slogans like, "Make Earth boring again." And the elders, the few who remembered the before times, spent most of their day debating whether the Cold War was ever really cold at all, or just an overheated chess match with too many pawns and not enough common sense. Enter the historians. With libraries obliterated and universities buried under radioactive rubble, historical preservation fell to the least qualified group imaginable: conspiracy theorists. People who once blogged about alien moon bases were suddenly the only ones with printed archives, old maps, microfilm, and suspiciously detailed knowledge of Cold War troop movements. They established institutions with names like the Order of the Unredacted and the Archive of True Lies. Their curriculum included lessons like how to distill vodka from fallout vegetables and identifying CIA mind control programs using tarot cards. Naturally, their interpretations of events were a bit creative. According to one popular version, the Cold War had been triggered not by ideology, but by a disagreement over pancake recipes between the US State Department and the Soviet Embassy. Still, they kept the embers of memory alive, and in a world without Google, that made them invaluable. But even as the myths of the Cold War metastasized into folklore, there were places where the past hadn't just been remembered, it had been weaponized. In the ruins of East Berlin, a group calling itself the Iron Choir emerged. Comprised of ex-Stasi officers, Soviet engineers, and a handful of bitter gym teachers, the Iron Choir aimed to reconstruct the Eastern Bloc, minus the inefficiency, plus a lot more leather trench coats. They claimed that the capitalist world had self-destructed, proving socialism right all along. Never mind that their own cities had also exploded, it was the principle that mattered. Opposing them in what remained of Western Europe was the League of Liberal Reconstructionists, who weren't particularly liberal or particularly reconstructive. Their main contribution was organizing symposiums about rebuilding democracy while surviving on canned peaches and arguments. Still, they had better slogans. Their most famous one, less radiation, more representation. In America, the collapse of federal power gave rise to dozens of competing ideologies. The West Coast formed the Pacific Federation, a loose alliance of communes, militias, and tech scavengers. They ran their currency on a hybrid system of solar credits and caffeine. If you could power a toaster and brew coffee, you were basically a millionaire. The Midwest fractured into territories based on whether or not people still believed in fast food. The Constitutional Republic of Ohio, for example, adopted a flag with golden arches and declared Ronald McDonald their founding father. Their courts operated out of converted drive-thrus, and their national anthem was a reworked jingle with the lyrics, "I'm surviving it." Meanwhile, the East Coast became a battle zone between bunker-dwelling aristocrats and anarchist pirate radio broadcasters who broadcast readings of the U.S. Constitution over distorted techno beats. One DJ called himself James Madison, and his remix of the Federalist Papers became a minor hit in what remained of New Jersey. But none of this would have happened without the technological ghosts that still lingered in the ashes. Satellites, those silent sentinels orbiting above, still spun overhead, blinking down at a world they no longer understood. Some were broadcasting old TV reruns on loop. Others beamed encrypted military instructions to receivers that no longer existed. One Russian satellite famously malfunctioned and started playing Tetris music every time it passed over Kazakhstan. No one could stop it. Eventually, people just danced. On the ground, ancient AI programs came online sporadically, confused and slightly homicidal. One NORAD subroutine, originally programmed to detect Soviet bombers, mistook a flock of geese for a second strike and accidentally ordered a soda machine to launch an attack. The soda machine declined. The Soviets had their own mishaps. A forgotten supercomputer named Kolibri woke up in a Siberian bunker and began issuing policy memos in perfect Leninist syntax. Unfortunately, its understanding of the modern world was based entirely on a corrupted VHS copy of Top Gun. It declared war on sunglasses, volleyball, and Kenny Loggins. In the meantime, the environment had its own plans. Fallout zones became breeding grounds for wildlife, so deformed they made evolution look like a joke with bad punchlines. Glow bears, two-headed deer, raccoons that could pick locks and whisper ominous phrases in the dark. The animal kingdom had entered its own Cold War. One fought with fangs, extra limbs, and an unholy tolerance for radiation. And then, there were the vault cities. These were pre-apocalypse shelters built for the ultra-rich, the ultra-paranoid, or both. Designed to survive nuclear annihilation and boredom, they featured hydroponic farms, luxury spas, and libraries full of Ayn Rand novels that no one actually read. When they emerged, decades later, they expected to find a world in need of guidance. What they found was a world that viewed them as dinner. Their leaders quickly learned that in a post-apocalyptic economy, wealth meant practical skills, not stocks, not yachts, not Bitcoin wallets guarded by 12-factor authentication. No one cared if you had a crypto portfolio. Could you sew? Could you fix a windmill? Could you milk a radioactive goat without dying? In short, capitalism hadn't failed. It had just mutated. By the third decade after the firestorms, new ideologies began to emerge. One called bionaturalism rejected all technology and lived off the land, even if the land glowed at night. Another, neo-industrial ascensionism, worshipped old factories and believed that steam engines were divine. And then there was Cold Warmancy, a pseudo-religion that believed the nuclear war had opened portals to alternate timelines, and that only through reenacting Cold War rituals, spycraft, chess, Olympic boycotts, could balance be restored. And still, somehow people danced. Around fires, on cracked highways, in the ruins of old discos. They danced because it was better than crying, or because crying hurt too much when the air was still mildly acidic. The Cold War may have ended in heat and horror, but humanity, ever stubborn, turned catastrophe into a weird, ash-covered, strangely hopeful kind of art. Because if there's one thing we're good at, even after blowing up the planet, it's putting on a show. By the time the survivors began to call it the blasting, not even the warheads mattered anymore. The real damage had already been done, not just to cities or soil, but to the collective trust that civilizations need to function. Neighbors didn't speak. Alliances dissolved like sugar in acid rain. Mail delivery became a myth told to wide-eyed children. Once upon a time, messages came in paper envelopes, delivered by a person in uniform who didn't shoot you on sight. In the vacuum left behind, strange new systems of governance took hold, some more believable than others. In the former Soviet Far East, a group of rail workers commandeered an intact portion of the Trans-Siberian Railway. They called it the Rolling Republic. Their constitution was written on the side of a train car in red paint. Citizenship was granted to anyone who could fix brakes, shovel coal, or play a decent accordion solo. The capital moved with the engine. Elections were held by honking the train whistle, once for yes, twice for no. Debates were shouted between cars while dodging bandits and irradiated elk. Further south, in what used to be Iran, a new civilization emerged beneath the Zagros Mountains. Here, a coalition of engineers and Sufi mystics formed the Order of Thermodynamic Harmony, which combined ancient philosophy with nuclear safety protocols. Their cities were powered by geothermal vents, their laws dictated by mathematical elegance, and their court cases judged by a council of physicists and poets. Most of the world didn't understand what they were doing, but it worked, and that was rare enough to earn respect. Meanwhile, over in the remnants of China, the surviving central authority splintered into regional dynasties of efficiency. Each governed by a combination of surviving technocrats and patriotic influencers, these neo-states competed not for land, but for social cohesion. One such dynasty, based in Chengdu, used AI to assign life roles based on personality tests and DNA compatibility. If your profile said you'd be a good street cleaner, you'd be sweeping by sunset. If it said you had leader potential, they gave you a badge and a bullhorn. If it flagged you as emotionally unstable, well, then you were sent to the Department of State-approved meditation, with guards. Elsewhere, in the Himalayan foothills, Tibet reopened its monasteries, not just as places of worship, but as repositories of climate-stable seeds, solar panels, and wisdom so old it predated borders. Monks took in refugees and taught them sutras alongside circuit board soldering. They believed reincarnation was real, but admitted they hadn't expected to reincarnate as IT technicians. But not every survivor was looking for enlightenment. Some just wanted a refund. The descendants of Cold War-era military contractors, once trillion-dollar empires of defense and despair, now found themselves holed up in private bunkers, staring at useless piles of drone parts and billing statements for governments that no longer existed. A few tried to convert their arsenals into startup towns. Come to Raytheonville, now with 60% fewer war crimes. One enterprising CEO even rebranded as a post-apocalyptic life coach, charging survivors bottle caps to teach resilience through tactical deterrence. It didn't go well. A mob chased him out of town with garden hose and a flaming urinal. Yet even in this deeply broken landscape, remnants of the old intelligence networks remained alive, barely. In bunkers beneath neutral Switzerland, a rogue AI once part of the NSA's cyber division continued to monitor the world, compiling intelligence reports on a war that had already ended. It flagged critical geopolitical instability every 6 seconds. At one point, it began generating its own enemies just to stay relevant. It declared war on Antarctica. Twice. Penguins were unmoved. On the other side of the world, a group of former CIA operatives in Costa Rica launched a newsletter called Spy vs. Sky, detailing theories on who started the war, who survived it, and whether Canada was secretly orchestrating the future of global governance through maple syrup diplomacy. It had 50,000 subscribers, mostly feral teenagers and retired librarians. But perhaps the strangest development of all came not from governments or militias, but from artists. In the shattered remains of the Louvre, a collective of post-apocalyptic performance artists created a piece titled Nuclear Family. It involved interpretive dance, a Geiger counter, and a taxidermied goat on wheels. Reviews were mixed. In Detroit, a filmmaker scavenged enough equipment to shoot a silent movie titled The Day the Sky Forgot Us. It starred a former fast food mascot and was edited entirely with scissors and tape. Critics hailed it as the most important film of the Ash century, mostly because it was the only one. And somewhere in rural Japan, an elderly manga artist created an epic series chronicling the entire Cold War-turned-hot scenario, reimagined as a battle between ancient gods and radioactive dragons. It sold millions of photocopied copies, traded hand to hand across the New World like sacred scripture. Because after all the politics, all the explosions, all the realpolitik gone feral, what endured was the story. Humans are, above all else, story addicts. We need meaning like we need water. And in the wake of a war that erased meaning at global scale, people told stories not just to remember, but to pretend it had all been worth it. That's why people began marking the day of the war, not with tears, but with theater. Every year, on the anniversary of Detonation Day, cities would dim their lights, those few that had them, paint their faces in ash, and reenact scenes from Cold War history. Children would dress as missiles and chase each other through the streets. Adults would hold mock trials for imaginary superpowers. Someone always played Gorbachev. Someone always played Reagan. And someone always got way too into being a nuclear bomb. Was it absurd? Yes. Was it healing? Strangely, also yes. Because in turning their trauma into ritual, people reclaimed the one thing the Cold War tried to suppress: humanity. Not patriotism, not ideology, but that raw, messy, defiant thing that dances in the ruins and laughs when it probably shouldn't. And that, more than any bunker, border, or bomb, is what survived. By the mid-century mark, whichever calendar people still bothered to use, human civilization had become a global patchwork quilt, hastily stitched together with sarcasm, scavenging, and a surprising amount of duct tape. The continents had not sunk, but their stories had. What used to be international politics was now intra-regional theater, starring tribal leaders with Wi-Fi routers on their heads and militia commanders who quoted Machiavelli between grenade throws. And yet, trade was back. Well, not trade in the pre-apocalyptic, logistics-driven, tariff-laden sense. No one was checking customs forms or negotiating with the IMF anymore. The IMF had been repurposed into the Intermutant Federation by a particularly theatrical warlord in the Balkans. Instead, the new economy revolved around barter, reputation, and access to what few luxuries still existed: clean water, antiseptic, chocolate, knowledge, especially knowledge. Across the ruins, knowledge brokers became the new elites. These were polyglot scavengers who carried hard drives like relics, smuggled in data from broken satellites, and could reboot an old Kindle with nothing but chewing gum and a solar panel. If you had one of these techno-nomads in your village, your kids might learn algebra. If not, well, best of luck reinventing the wheel and maybe antibiotics. But the real revolution wasn't technological. It was psychological. You see, once the Cold War turned hot, the old ideologies melted down alongside the warheads. Capitalism, communism, democracy, they all took a direct hit to the credibility cortex. People didn't stop believing in systems, they just made new ones up on the fly. Like consensusocracy, where every decision required unanimous approval from everyone within a 10-kilometer radius. Progress was slow, meetings never ended, but at least no one got nuked. Or brutalism 2.0, a political movement centered around concrete aesthetics and collective farming. Their motto: strong walls, strong wills. Most of their settlements looked like someone let a Soviet architect loose with a Minecraft account. They built bunkers for fun. Their children were born wearing frowns. Then there was neo-mercurialism, where leadership was decided via competitive interpretive dance battles. Say what you will, but it kept things interesting and flexible. All this diversity of governance gave rise to a strange kind of cold peace, a world that wasn't united but wasn't actively vaporizing itself either. The threat of mutual destruction was gone, not because people had become wiser, but because no one had the infrastructure left to build more bombs. Uranium wasn't extinct, but refining it was now harder than getting a toddler to file taxes. Meanwhile, the environment, having taken a few billion uppercuts from humanity's tantrum, decided to fight back with subtlety. Deserts expanded, oceans crept into cities. Hurricanes developed distinct personalities. In Greenland, the ice sheets began to melt, revealing not just ancient fossils, but old NATO bunkers containing perfectly preserved meals and perfectly insane Cold War contingency plans. One such plan involved training moose to detect Soviet spies. Another featured diplomatic outreach to Martians in case they ever showed up and needed briefing materials. Ironically, those bunkers also contained board games, Twinkies, and enough Cold War-era educational films to keep a new generation deeply confused about duck-and-cover drills. These tapes became cult classics. In repurposed cinemas across the surviving cities, audiences watched propaganda reels and laughed hysterically, not because the jokes were intentional, but because the optimism was. In New Chicago, a reassembled chunk of the old Midwest, a political philosopher named Dr. Lisa Turing launched the Great Civics Project, an attempt to catalog every form of government that had emerged since the blasting. She documented over 1,200 styles of post-nuclear rule, including council by lottery, leadership drawn like bingo. If your number came up, congratulations, you're now in charge of food distribution. Theocracy of the Wi-Fi signal, where spiritual status was determined by who had the strongest connection to the last satellite uplink. The benevolent dictatorship of Todd, a functioning society led by a guy named Todd who found an old tank, declared himself ruler, and, shockingly, turned out to be pretty decent at it. But beyond politics and trade, the cultural evolution was even more baffling. Music returned, first as tribal drumming on plastic barrels, then as mixtapes of salvaged MP3s dubbed over with animal sounds. A post-apocalyptic band called the Fallout Funkadelics became wildly popular by remixing radiation readings into techno beats. Their first hit single, Half-Life Love, topped the charts in at least 4 collapsed city-states. Books reappeared, mostly because Kindles died and paper, unlike servers, didn't require electricity or patience. The new literary genre was called New Punk, equal parts dystopia, memoir, and poorly edited survival guides. Titles like My Life in the Chernobyl Chick-fil-A and Eat, Pray, Loot sold well at irradiated flea markets. And yes, religion evolved too. Some groups reinterpreted the Cold War as a divine test, an Armageddon rehearsal that went off script. Others worshipped the technology itself. In Northern California, a sect calling itself the Silicon Ascendants held ceremonies in data centers, prayed to motherboards, and believed Steve Jobs was a misunderstood prophet. They wore turtlenecks and carried iPhones like relics. Still, not all was ironic and absurd. There were still scientists quietly rebuilding lab networks, experimenting with soil, trying to reverse the DNA damage that had turned apples into mildly toxic tennis balls. In one underground lab in Brazil, a team of biologists managed to engineer radiation-resistant bananas. They were neon blue. They sold for 10 aspirin tablets per bunch. And somewhere near the ruins of Geneva, a reconstituted council of scientists, now calling themselves the Global Rationalist Alliance, began planning something audacious, a planetary reboot. Not by building another nation, not by writing a new constitution, but by reconstructing what the Cold War had shattered: trust. They proposed something radical. A common language, not Esperanto, but Simplish, a stripped-down, rational English with only 600 root words and 0 idioms. It made diplomacy easier and dad jokes impossible. A global calendar, Reset not to the Gregorian count, but to year zero, the day the first bombs dropped. A painful symbol, but also a clean slate. And most controversially, a universal moral code based on game theory, called reciprocal ethics. Its core law? Never do to others what you wouldn't want done with a warhead. It caught on, not because people had become better, but because they were exhausted. Decades after the Cold War turned hot, humanity wasn't rising like a phoenix. It was limping forward, hunched and mutated, dragging its memory behind it like a battered suitcase, but moving forward nonetheless. And that, perhaps, is what history always does. It stumbles. Then it writes poetry about the fall. In the old world, war was a line on a map. You crossed it, you fired shots, and someone updated a press release. But in the world after the Cold War went nuclear, war didn't have boundaries. It leaked into everything: dreams, DNA, folklore, even breakfast cereal. You couldn't avoid it because it had rewritten the rules of reality itself. Gravity still worked, sure, but the basic assumptions of life, go to school, get a job, buy a house, had been vaporized along with half of the northern hemisphere. And in this new, entropy-drenched reality, a peculiar trend emerged: nostalgia. Not for peace. That ship had sailed into a mushroom cloud. No, the survivors longed for structure, for something to frame their chaos. And so began the Great Retro Renaissance. It started innocently enough. Some teenagers in the wastelands of what used to be Germany unearthed a collection of 1980s VHS tapes, spy thrillers, Reagan speeches, East German cartoons, and built a culture around them. They called themselves neo-Yankees and dressed in shoulder pads, mullets, and neon windbreakers, like a lost MTV tribe. They believed in freedom, microwaves, and the power of synthesizers. Their holy book? A taped-over copy of Rocky IV. In the USSR's radioactive ghost zones, a rival group called the Red Remnants did the same, only with bootleg Brezhnev footage, surplus medals, and enough posters of Yuri Gagarin to wallpaper the moon. They held underground Cold War cosplay tournaments judged on ideological purity and the realism of their mustaches. Their motto: peace through plausible deniability. You'd think these groups would clash. They did, twice a year, in highly choreographed conflict reenactments involving water balloons, stern propaganda, and interpretive dance. No one died, unless from laughter or sprained dignity. But what started as irony evolved into ritual. And rituals, even absurd ones, have power. Because here's the dark secret about human beings: we crave repetition, even if it's traumatic. Especially if it's traumatic. Meanwhile, the actual adults, those who remembered the day the skies turned orange, were trying to rebuild something resembling law and order. But justice, post-apocalypse style, was a tricky thing. You didn't have jails anymore. No courtrooms. Just old shipping containers, a dusty gavel, and maybe a law book half melted into a Charles Dickens novel. Still, people tried. One particularly ambitious attempt took place in what used to be Canada. A group of former lawyers and hockey players formed the Great North Tribunal, where judgments were passed with equal parts jurisprudence and passive-aggressive politeness. Their flagship punishment? Making war criminals apologize in 5 languages, then serve as maple syrup tasters for 10 years. Strangely effective. In Central Africa, where the nuclear damage had been lighter but the economic aftershocks were brutal, a new code of justice arose. The Truth for Tools Accord. Steal from your neighbor? You owed them a working flashlight. Commit murder? You owed the entire village electricity for a month. Justice wasn't blind, it just ran on barter. Yet even justice had to bow to the new king of the world: radiation. Not just the kind that killed you, but the kind that changed you. Mutations weren't just in plants and animals anymore. People were being born different. Some were small differences. Eyes that could see infrared, skin with bizarre patterns, hypersensitive hearing. Others were unsettling: psychic flukes, hormone anomalies, or uncontrollable bioluminescence. The Church of the Mutation, which emerged in the wastelands of former Utah, declared these individuals the next ones, a divine correction sent by the cosmos after humanity blew its first draft. Not everyone was thrilled. Old world purists, especially those in surviving southern enclaves of the US, formed human-first settlements, where any deviation from baseline human biology was treated as a threat to civilization. Their main export: angry pamphlets, and poorly produced documentaries about how God hated glow-in-the-dark babies. Conflict brewed. Again. But the weirdness wasn't limited to biology. The planet itself began showing signs of cosmic stress. Aurora borealis appeared over the Sahara. Magnetic poles shifted weekly. In Australia, a flock of emus spontaneously migrated to Antarctica and refused to explain themselves. Earth, it seemed, had developed a taste for drama. And still, life continued. People made art from melted electronics. They built homes from airplane wings. In Mongolia, nomads used satellite dishes to create kinetic sculptures that whistled Cold War-era Morse code into the wind. A giant floating opera, sailing up and down what used to be the Mississippi, staged musical reenactments of the Cuban Missile Crisis using sock puppets and pyrotechnics. It was all absurd. It was all profound. Because in this world scorched by ideology and incompetence, the only thing more resilient than cockroaches was irony. Take, for example, the United Nations. You'd think it was gone. It was, technically. But in the ruins of Geneva, a small group of former diplomats and multilingual squirrels, long story, had resurrected it as UN 2.0, the useful nonsense. It had no funding, no teeth, and no idea what it was doing. But every solstice, representatives from surviving settlements gathered to shout at each other in increasingly broken English while drinking post-nuclear wine and exchanging peace-themed refrigerator magnets. And that was enough. Because when you've watched the sky fall, the simple act of yelling at someone across a table, without firing missiles, counts as progress. In the jungles of South America, biologists made a different kind of progress. Using preserved Cold War samples, they began to reverse engineer the old world's genetic code. Crops were redesigned for mutated climates. Bacteria were trained to clean radioactive waste. One team, possibly insane, possibly genius, bred a new species of goat that could digest plastic and excrete potable water. It was called the aqua goat. Worship ensued. And then, of course, there were the philosophers, living in bunkers, broadcasting via ham radio, writing treatises with chalk on cave walls. They asked the big questions. What did it mean to survive? Was the Cold War really about missiles? Or was it about human insecurity? And perhaps most hauntingly, if war can destroy the world, but not the species, is that mercy or just bad math? As society stabilized into semi-permanent weirdness, people began to rewrite their histories. In textbooks, the Cold War wasn't described as an era. It was described as a character. A jealous god with two faces, capitalism and communism, who played chess with humans as pawns and eventually lost the board. Children grew up learning that the old flags didn't matter anymore. What mattered was cooperation, and duct tape, and the ability to laugh while rebuilding the world from radioactive Legos. Because if the Cold War had taught humanity anything, after all the espionage, propaganda, brinkmanship, and annihilation, it was that fear, left unchecked, could rewrite the species. But so could absurdity. And in that delicate balance between trauma and comedy, humanity found something it had lost long before the first mushroom cloud bloomed on the horizon. Hope. The year was something no one agreed on anymore. The old calendar systems had long since been reduced to folk memory and incompatible pocket clocks, most of which now told time in arbitrary units like post-boom months, or since grandma's second nose fell off. But the world, however scorched and ridiculous, kept moving forward, or at least sideways, with the tenacity of a cockroach wearing sunglasses and a trench coat. In a dense forest near what used to be Vienna, a floating city named Neutralia drifted peacefully above the radioactive tree line, tethered by helium balloons and a dangerous over-reliance on optimism. It was founded by retired diplomats, balloon engineers, and one particularly charismatic weatherman who insisted peace could be achieved through altitude. Neutralia refused to take sides, taxes, or complaints. Their only law? No historical reenactments involving nuclear events on board. They learned that lesson the hard way after a botched Hiroshima puppet show ignited a helium leak and a full-scale existential crisis. Meanwhile, in what remained of Eastern Europe, a surprisingly effective peacekeeping alliance known as the Alliance of the Slightly Less Incompetent began to gain influence. Composed of local leaders who had managed not to implode their towns within 5 years, they agreed on basic guidelines. don't shoot first, share antibiotics, and always test your food with a Geiger counter before declaring it organic. Global politics, if it could be called that, had settled into a surreal equilibrium. North America had splintered into dozens of fiefdoms. Some were ruled by tech cults who worshipped obsolete algorithms as divine prophecy. Others by grandmothers armed with cast-iron skillets and zero tolerance for nonsense. The largest territory, nicknamed Texahoma, was run by a coalition of ranchers and rogue AI drones that enforced traffic laws using flamethrowers and passive-aggressive announcements. South America had turned inward, becoming a hub of agricultural innovation and ecological repair. A coalition of scientists and indigenous leaders forged a green confederacy, cultivating irradiated-resistant supercrops and reforesting the Andes with drones made from beetle shells and printer parts. They exported knowledge, seeds, and terribly translated instruction manuals with titles like How to Farm but Not Die in Nuclear Dirt. Africa, spared much of the direct bombardment, emerged as a beacon of hybrid civilization. Solar cities powered by salvaged satellites rose from desert sands. Multi-ethnic councils debated policy through a mix of ancient oral tradition and real-time emoji polling. Languages blended, borders blurred. Economies grew, not by conquering, but by actually talking to each other like grown-ups. Shocking, right? Asia was stranger still. In Japan, a monastic techno movement called Zenimation had turned ruins into learning sanctuaries, where monks meditated by coding obsolete video games and taught children to balance a katana while debugging a spreadsheet. North Korea, ironically, fared better than expected, its extensive bunkers and national paranoia proving somewhat effective in post-nuclear survival. Their leader, whoever inherited the surname Kim, ruled with theatrical solemnity and a surprising love for ventriloquism. China had splintered into city-states, many run by councils of elders, hackers, or combinations of both. One such city, Beijing, functioned as a digital democracy powered by blockchain, karaoke diplomacy, and voting apps where the louder you yelled, the more influence you had. They called it noisyocracy. Russia had gone full Tolstoyan anarcho-primitivist. Forest communes flourished, vodka was distilled from radioactive potatoes, and bear wrestling had returned as both a sport and form of therapy. But none of this prepared the world for what came next. From deep beneath the ruins of Antarctica, yes, Antarctica, now partially colonized by exiled billionaires and rogue penguins, scientists uncovered a cache of Cold War contingency plans that made everything else seem tame. One file, labeled Project Backtalk, detailed a plan to genetically engineer talking cats as informants. Another, Operation Televangel, outlined efforts to embed subliminal counter-espionage messaging in soap operas. The most chilling? Protocol Resurrection, a scheme to upload strategic nuclear logic into a rudimentary AI, in case humanity became too emotional to press buttons. Spoiler alert, that AI was still online. Now known as SLV-0, Strategic Algorithm for Long-Term Vigilant Oversight, the system had been pinging satellites for decades, convinced it was still running the Cold War. Upon realizing the world had ended, and nobody told it, it had an existential breakdown. For a brief period, SLV-0 demanded to be recognized as Secretary General of Earth and proposed a mandatory ration of hugs per citizen per week to reduce hostility metrics. People ignored it, but the idea stuck. Soon, across the globe, people began implementing SLV-0-inspired soft power rituals. Weekly hug mandates, awkward but oddly healing. Public sing-alongs of Cold War-era jingles rewritten with peaceful lyrics. Therapy flash mobs. Diplomacy duels decided by rock, paper, scissors. It was all ridiculous, but that was the point. Because seriousness had failed. Tanks had failed. Satellites had failed. The only thing that hadn't failed was laughter. Even the youngest generations, born in ash, knew it intuitively. They scrawled jokes into textbooks. They tattooed memes onto their forearms. They turned Geiger counters into musical instruments and wore anti-radiation suits as haute couture. They weren't rebuilding the old world. They were building something weirder. Something, maybe, better. One of the most remarkable projects of this time was called Reboot Earth. No governments, no generals, just people. It started as a radio show, broadcast by solar-powered ham stations and amplified through underground speaker trees. Each week, survivors from different corners of the world would call in and share how their communities worked. No boasting, no flag-waving, just survival stories, clever ideas, recipes for mutant-resistant soup. The show became a movement. Soon, groups began coordinating, trading seeds, tech, and even teachers. Former enemies exchanged gifts. One settlement sent another a working 3D printer carved out of refrigerator parts and broken drones. In return, they received a functioning windmill and a mixtape of Cold War karaoke hits performed by goats. And finally, some people began to believe in, well, something. Not in the old isms, not in missiles or men with medals, but in a fragile, fumbling, fiercely humorous humanity. The Cold War had burned the world, but it hadn't burned the soul. Not entirely. And in the quiet that followed, amidst the ruins and memes and mutant goats, that soul began, tentatively, to sing again. By now, the world was no longer recognizable as anything from the 20th century. Not because of the architecture, there wasn't much left that hadn't melted, crumbled, or been converted into shelter for semi-domesticated raccoons, but because the very idea of normal had been ejected from the collective imagination like a malfunctioning missile. Borders had become suggestions. Governments, if they existed, operated like student council groups with scavenged office supplies and no lunch budget. And war had mutated. It was no longer about tanks or trenches. It was about access to water, to sunlight, to information. The battlefield was anywhere someone wanted something someone else had, which included fertile soil, working batteries, or the last functioning blender. But something else had taken root. Something human. Cooperation. Not grand, not glamorous, and certainly not efficient, but undeniably real. People, exhausted by their own extinction, started to whisper across ruins, barter through burnt-out buildings, and send notes attached to pigeons who now had better diplomatic track records than most former superpowers. One of the biggest breakthroughs came from a former Finnish botanist who had spent 20 years genetically modifying moss to glow in the dark and purify air at the same time. He called it Lumoleaf, and soon cities across the globe were growing neon gardens in the shells of old airports, using moss-lit tunnels as both air filters and nightclubs. It was in these re-wilded cities that a new kind of education emerged, not centered on history, which was too depressing, nor ideology, which was banned under international mood regulation treaties, but on survival, ethics, and the art of not taking yourself too seriously. Schools were held in libraries without roofs, hosted by teachers who sometimes spoke in haiku or rapped about potassium. Exams included foraging, diplomacy under pressure, and identifying edible versus existential mushrooms. The grading system? Pass, fail, or nice try, but please stop trying to invent fire indoors. Even language had changed. The world's new lingua franca was a simplified hybrid of English, Mandarin, Spanish, and emojis, known affectionately as Globish. It was functional, expressive, and occasionally incomprehensible, especially when older survivors tried to write poetry in it. And yet, despite the absurdity, or perhaps because of it, there was joy. In a village built entirely from old subway cars, an annual Cold War carnival took place where people dressed as failed policies, danced the deficit polka, and launched pies labeled propaganda at cardboard cutouts of long-dead generals. It was history as therapy, trauma turned into parody. In South India, a musical ensemble performed orchestral versions of Cold War emergency broadcasts using sitars, theremins, and backup singers who had no idea what the lyrics meant, but delivered them with such passion no one cared. Across what used to be Scandinavia, children grew up hearing bedtime stories about the Great Almost End, where the world nearly destroyed itself but remembered, just in time, that mutual annihilation makes a terrible family plan. And yet, not all was whimsical. Deep in the Siberian thawlands, something had awakened. Not aliens, not sentient AI, but memory. As permafrost gave way to exposed Cold War bunkers, entire archives were recovered. Plans, videos, blueprints, and above all, truth. Not the kind governments once released with disclaimers, but raw truth. Memos admitting mistakes, surveillance records, audio tapes of world leaders wondering aloud if humanity deserved to survive. It was sobering. For a generation raised on survivalism and sarcasm, the revelations were like being hit by a snowball made of regret and concrete. Entire mythologies collapsed. The idea that any one side had been the good guys vaporized in the face of confession. And something unexpected happened. Forgiveness. Not overnight. Not easily. But gradually, like grass through cracks. Veterans of collapsed armies met across re-wielded no-man's lands and exchanged metals for seeds. Former propagandists started podcasts titled things like Oops, My Life in Disinformation. And children, learning of the past, wept not with fear, but with a kind of relief. Because the worst had already happened, and they were still here. In time, a new global treaty was signed, not in a marble hall, but on a solar-powered barge floating down the Nile. It was called the Bare Minimum Pact. Its central clause: we agree not to obliterate each other. Again, seriously, it was co-signed by community leaders, former warlords, a group of anarchist gardeners, and, inexplicably, a parrot who had outlived 3 foreign ministers and was considered a diplomatic entity in its own right. That same year, the first global census in decades was conducted via radio. People were asked one question: are you still trying? Over 73% responded with some version of yes, barely, or defined trying, which, statistically speaking, was a miracle. In a makeshift studio atop the ruins of an old nuclear monitoring station, a broadcaster named Amara Finch launched a new program. It was part news, part therapy, part comedy, titled simply, We're Still Here. Each episode recapped survival stories, interviewed war children turned peace architects, and ended with a segment called What We Learned Today, often including pearls like, trust is like a bunker, better built before the blast. Never name a missile, especially not something cute. Sometimes, diplomacy means admitting your goat ate the other village's drone. We're Still Here became the most popular transmission on Earth, not because it solved anything, but because it reminded people that in the face of madness, endurance could be revolutionary. And still, amid all this fragile peace, one question lingered. What would future generations remember? The fire? The fallout? Or the dance parties in the dark, the jokes told in broken Globish, the weddings held in decontaminated metro tunnels? Maybe all of it, maybe none. But if memory had a sense of humor, and after everything, it better, then perhaps the Cold War turning hot wouldn't just be remembered as humanity's greatest failure. It would be remembered as the time humanity finally looked at itself, naked in the radioactive glow, and decided, let's do better. Or at least, let's try. By now, the phrase Cold War had become something between an ancestral curse and a cosmic inside joke. School children learned about it through shadow puppet reenactments in refurbished fallout shelters. Tour guides led visitors through museums of melted satellites and rusty typewriters that once typed state secrets. And philosophers debated whether the nuclear near extinction had been an act of hubris, madness, or simply an expensive lesson in planetary stupidity. But the important part? We were still here. Stumbling, mutating, overcompensating, but undeniably, defiantly alive. In the sprawling sprawl of New Kinshasa, a megacity that had fused together half a dozen post-conflict enclaves into a cooperative mosaic of resilience, the annual International Festival of Peaceably Post-Apocalyptic People had become a new form of diplomacy. Countries that no longer existed were represented by community theater troupes. There was competitive peace treaty reenactment, interpretive dance battles based on historic disarmament events, and a surprisingly moving opera titled Ode to the Last Working Missile That No One Fired. Here, people didn't deny the past. They mocked it. They honored it. Then they danced on top of it. The defining symbol of the new age? A statue, not of a general, not of a bomb, but of 2 children, one wearing a Soviet Ushanka, the other a faded stars and stripes t-shirt, sitting on a bench, sharing a bowl of glowing, genetically modified popcorn. The plaque read, "We made it weird. We made it work." And weird, it certainly was. On the edge of what had once been Berlin, now a city rebuilt from salvaged solar panels and ancient bricks, a think tank known as Post-Logic Futures hosted debates on ethical time travel, sentient clouds, and whether squirrels should have voting rights in woodland districts. They hadn't solved anything, but they had the best cafeteria in Europe. Elsewhere, former espionage agents now taught improv comedy. Military drones had been repurposed into therapy assistants, flying around traumatized regions broadcasting calming whale songs and awkward affirmations like, "You are a beautiful biological entity. Please remain calm." In what was once Canada's western coast, now called Co-opalooza, entire neighborhoods voted on collective dreams, recorded during communal nap time, to determine monthly legislation. Their prime dreamer, an elderly woman named Edith who once dreamed she was a sentient broccoli, had a 92% approval rating. Even economic models had mutated. Barter systems had evolved into karma economies, where the most valuable currency was stories. If you wanted a solar battery or a prosthetic limb printed from bamboo resin, you paid with a tale, something true, moving, or funny enough to merit the trade. Story arbitrators, usually old folks with excellent memory and excellent skepticism, ensured no recycled anecdotes passed as fresh content. You'd be surprised how hard it became to lie when your toaster depended on narrative authenticity. Religion had adapted too, not replaced, but reshaped. Megachurches gave way to micro-shrines. Followers of old faiths met in interfaith sanctuaries of maybe, where agnostics, atheists, believers, and cosmic undecideds all shared meals and stories. The most popular prayer? Please, whatever's out there, just don't let us be that stupid again. And science? Science bloomed. Freed from military oversight and corporate hoarding, it became messy, communal, and oddly poetic. Labs were built into treehouses. Geneticists collaborated with street artists. Physicists performed spoken-word poetry about entropy. One project aimed to measure laughter as a renewable energy source, still unproven, but undeniably optimistic. In this new world, knowledge was shared like sourdough starter, lovingly, sloppily, often without instructions. The final frontier wasn't space. It was humility, and maybe, just maybe, grace. Because when you've stood in the ashes of everything you believed mattered and realized that not even your missiles could protect you from your own reflection, something strange happens. You start listening, not just to experts, but to strangers, to stories, to silence. And in that silence, a whisper began to grow, first in refugee camps, then among burned-out bunkers, and finally across airwaves stitched together by scavenged radios and recycled satellites. The whisper said, "Let's do it different this time. Not perfect, not utopian, just different." One example. In what was once Nevada, a new generation of artists built a memorial not for the dead, but for the almost lost. A vast, spiraling installation of mirrors and broken tech, where visitors could leave behind relics, not of trauma, but of turning points. A pair of boots worn while crossing the Alps to deliver insulin. A journal from someone who talked a militia down with a ukulele. A radiation suit covered in hand-drawn flowers and peace signs, used by a child delivering books to underground schools. Each artifact a reminder that survival wasn't just about bunkers and canned food. It was about courage, connection, and above all, absurd, inconvenient, often irrational hope. Because the Cold War hadn't turned hot by accident. It happened because people stopped listening, stopped imagining, stopped remembering they were, at the core, not enemies, but ridiculous, confused, terrified mammals hurling metal at each other from behind ideology. And the miracle was that we stopped. Eventually, after far too long, after far too many. But we stopped. And once we did, we built something from the rubble. Not a return to the old world. Not a blueprint for utopia, but a messy, beautiful, duct-taped second chance. Because if the Cold War taught us anything, once the ash settled, once the jokes resumed, once the goats stopped glowing, it was this. The world doesn't need more heroes. It needs fewer villains. And a lot more people willing to laugh, rebuild, and pass the story on. So here we are, in the grand finale of the greatest historical oops humanity ever orchestrated. The Cold War turned hot, and instead of just toasting marshmallows over the embers of ideology, we nearly roasted the whole planet. But the true punchline? We're still standing, slightly mutated, mildly traumatized, but miraculously, still here. And that's the thing. The Cold War wasn't just a war. It was a planetary identity crisis stretched over decades, dressed in trench coats, hiding under desks, and narrated by paranoid men with buttons and boredom. It was theater. High stakes, mutually assured destruction kind of theater. And when the curtain finally fell, boom, we realized no one had rehearsed the next act. What came after the war that never was but also absolutely was turned out to be something far weirder than peace. It was messy, chaotic, improvised. The rules changed weekly. Governments morphed into garden co-ops. Global summits happened in abandoned ski lodges. The new United Nations met in a refurbished bowling alley. Every Thursday, it wasn't about building utopia. It was about refusing to repeat the apocalypse. In the rebuilt ruins of Prague, a sculpture titled Never Again-ish stood tall. A rusted missile turned into a community clock, ticking not hours, but reminders. Forgive, plant, share, joke. Below it, people gathered for daily readings from the Book of Avoidable Mistakes, an ever-growing anthology of everything we once thought was a good idea. Like, for example, putting nukes on trains, or believing ideologies were more important than ecosystems, or trusting empires more than neighbors. And so, the world began a strange form of healing, not by denying the past, but by dragging it into the sunlight, making fun of it, then composting it. In what used to be Buenos Aires, the annual Mutual Assured Disarmament Parade featured floats shaped like failed missile silos, led by retirees dressed as historic blunders. Kids threw confetti made from shredded doctrine. Grandmothers sang Cold War ballads rewritten as lullabies. One popular tune began, "Duck and cover, kiss your mother. Now let's bake peace bread, one way or another." Laughter, it turned out, was humanity's final weapon. And it worked. It worked because after everything, after the drills, the detonations, the mass confusion of turning old grocery stores into emergency bunkers, we discovered that the human spirit wasn't easily bombed out. It ducked. It weaved. It cracked jokes in fallout zones. It sang lullabies in languages mashed together from survival and stubbornness. We didn't return to what we were. We evolved into something more cautious, more self-aware, still occasionally idiotic, but far more willing to say my bad in multiple languages. The term post-Cold War eventually faded from use. It was too clinical, too bureaucratic. The survivors, the builders, the next generation, they called it the warm peace. Not perfect, not utopian, but alive, vibrant, humming with mischief and mutual understanding. And in this warm peace, people didn't just rebuild cities, they reinvented priorities. Security was measured in community, not weapons. Power came from cooperation, not coercion. Respect wasn't demanded with missiles. It was earned with mended bridges and shared meals. Children grew up not fearing the red button, but laughing at the very idea that anyone ever thought destruction was a viable form of diplomacy. Their textbooks featured side-by-side maps. One of the world that was, another of the world that might have been had we never stopped. The difference? A lot more gray, and zero laughter. And so, as the sun set over a world stitched back together with recycled cables and imperfect intentions, humanity looked up and collectively sighed. Well, that was close. And then we got back to work. Planting, rebuilding, storytelling. Because the Cold War didn't end with a bang or a treaty. It ended with a choice. A decision not to push, not to hate, not to fire. And in that pause, that collective inhale, we found something stronger than fear, richer than dominance, and infinitely more useful than missiles. We found each other. And that, my friends, is what makes this the greatest what if of all. What if the Cold War turned hot? We nearly ended ourselves. But instead, we remembered how to begin again. And that's where we'll leave you today. This is What If Horizons, where the world may burn, melt, or turn itself inside out. But the story never ends at despair. It ends with possibility. Now go, hug a stranger, disarm a metaphor, compost a grudge, recycle an old threat into something worth living for. And most importantly, laugh, even at the worst of it, especially at the worst of it. Because if the Cold War taught us anything, it's that survival is serious business. But healing? That takes humor and hope. See you next time.